Welcome back to the channel. My name is Luke Jean, and I have back here once again Mr. James B. Edgerly of the Higher Purpose Forum. How you doing today?
Luke, I'm great when I get to talk with you.
Thank you. And likewise, it's almost Halloween. Things are busy. Candy's out there, but today we're gonna focus on more Christianity. We're going to focus a lot more on specifically evangelical Protestantism. So if you recall from our last video, which if you haven't watched it yet, please go watch it. The link will be down below. We discussed Mr. Edgerly's post-Protestant thesis. He's published a booklet on this, which you can find at the Higher Purpose Forum website. It's right there. Definitely a very interesting read because what it talks about is how there is, in his view, and his booklet talks about this, a noticeable decline in mainline Protestantism, which is the foundational form of Christianity in this country since the first European immigrants, specifically the Puritans and the Pilgrims, came to American soil. But now there's something that is potentially, and we're going to discuss this, replacing it. Evangelical Protestantism. So, Mr. Edgerly, I want to start out with this question. What is evangelical Protestantism and what are its basic tenets? Because from my understanding, and you've done a kind of a poster presentation about this topic, which I will also link below, if that's okay, or maybe we can discuss that later. You discussed how it's not just a denomination, but it's cross-denominational. So let's start with that. What is it?
First of all, I might just say why it's become so important. And that is because, as you said, the cultural core of our country is gone. And that cultural core, which created the values and the virtues in our culture for 400 years, mainline Protestantism is now down to 10 or 11% of U.S. adults are involved with mainline Protestantism in some form. And even those that are involved, the churches are very, very poorly attended, elderly, not very high-spirited. I've visited them. I've been to them. I'm sure you have too. I don't mean to be critical. That's the faith tradition that I come out of. So to me, that's a very, very important part of my understanding of what is really behind our country. But that's pretty much withering away, and it is not coming back. And in our last meeting, I explained this loss of consensus. And I'm really relieved through my studies and my personal experience, which I'm happy to share about, have come to conclude that there is now a full-fledged replacement tradition that is making a major, taking a major role in creating a new cultural core for our country, and that is Protestant evangelicalism or evangelical Protestantism. So my booklet was called The Post-Protestant Thesis, but if I was to write it again, I have to change that topic, the Post-Mainline Protestant Thesis. Because evangelical Protestantism is Protestantism, but it's in a new form. And that form is what you're asking me about. And it's actually an area of great debate because, as you said, evangelical Protestantism is not a denomination. It's a cross-denominational spiritual movement, just like mainline Protestantism. It's not a single church or a single set of beliefs. It's a chorus of, it's a movement. And the reason that evangelical Protestantism is so important is because it's the same thing. It's a movement within Protestantism. And it is the most, by far and away, the most important movement within Protestantism. That is not to say that Judaism and Catholicism and mainline Protestantism and the sectarian faiths are not very important to our country. They are. But there's a central pillar. It used to be mainline Christianity. It withered away. And to take its place, we now have a beautiful new Christian spirit that comes to us in the form of evangelical Protestantism. Okay, so your question was, what is it? Okay. So again, it's an area of great debate among evangelicals, but the most commonly accepted definition is what's called the Bebbington the Bebbington quadrilateral.
Bebington Quadrilateral.
Yes,
If
and
you're at home, say that. Bebington Quadrilateral. So
remember
you
that.
remember.
Yeah, remember that. Now, Bebbington is not from the United States. Bebbington is from England, but he has come up with a definition that people find that has sort of stuck. There's some definitions that have 6 points, some that have 5, some that have 7. This one has 4. Okay, the first point is evangelicals believe in the central importance of having a personal conversion rebirth experience in which you begin a very, very personal spiritual life with Jesus, with God. You have a personal experience of changing your life. Now, that has a great pedigree. That comes out of the Second Great Awakening. The spirituality of evangelical Protestantism is directly linked. Its DNA comes out of the great awakenings of the 17th and 18th centuries. I should say, the 18th and 19th century. The second pillar is that the Bible, this is Protestantism as distinct from Catholicism. The Bible is a definitive source for guidance for the moral and spiritual religious decisions that we make in our personal life. Our definitive source for truth is the Bible, the Word of God. It's not any authority. It's not any office. It's not any orthodoxy. It's a book, the Bible, the Word of God.
And that's very important because for our viewers, Catholicism is very clear that tradition is actually on par with scripture in Catholicism. So that's a huge difference. The church fathers, the preachers, they are in mainline Protestantism and Protestantism in general, including evangelical Protestantism, not at the same level as scripture. Not at all.
That's correct. But it's unambiguous in evangelical Protestantism. Unambiguous. The Bible is the source upon which you make the decisions in your life. I love this stuff, man. This personal experience of rebirth, this reliance on God's word in our life is beautiful to me. The third point, you'll like this one, Luke, is a commitment to public activism. That if you love God, if you're committed to the gospel, you're active publicly in your family, in your community, in the world. That's why evangelicals are involved with all sorts of institutions, social, political, cultural institutions, because they express their faith and their gratitude and their recognition of their gospel responsibilities by public activism. Amen?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably why in evangelical Protestant churches, those churches who are part of that group bring politics into the Sunday service.
Mm-hmm.
If that, I mean, there are some churches that do not do that. I
Right?
think, in my experience, Catholic churches in the Mass often, if they're a more traditional Catholic church, they will not really talk about politics that much. But you're saying this is a very unique feature because it's this value and pillar of activism.
Activism, social outreach, not separation. There's a big thing that happened in the 40s with evangelical Protestantism. At that time, it was called neo-evangelicalism, and they made a distinct break with fundamentalists who wanted to separate from the culture and isolate themselves. And the evangelical faith departed from that and very explicitly said, no, our culture is going to engage in the world. We're going to be open intellectually. We're going to be inquisitive and engaged in culture because God cares about the world. Now, Luke, when I go to, I've been to quite a few evangelical Christian churches, and I always have a wonderful experience. And they don't really get into politics in the Sunday gathering, but people who are evangelicals get engaged in culture and in economics and in politics.
I see. Okay.
This is
That's a good distinction.
yeah. because that also comes out of the Great Awakenings that preceded them. This idea that you can revive and bring grace not only into the individual but also into the family and also into the business, and you can bring it into politics. God cares about all that stuff. And then the
This
fourth,
this
sorry, go
makes
ahead.
me bring up a question. So in evangelical Protestantism, do they believe, or to what extent do they believe in the separation of church and state?
Well, my understanding of evangelical Protestantism is that it's pretty much right now, its roots are in the United States. Its roots are in the Great Awakening. Its identity is largely American, and therefore it's committed to the separation of church and state. I have not seen any. There are other aspects of conservative Christianity that might not feel that way, but evangelical Protestantism is committed to separation of church and state.
That makes sense. I mean, they're very a minority group of Catholics, for example, who the very, very far right wingers like Nick Fuentes, for example, don't believe in church and state. So you're
Right.
saying it's kind of similar where you might have a segment of conservative Christians that are part of that group but don't believe in church and state. But for the most part, because it's rooted in that American identity, they are separate. Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah. I would not conflate evangelical Protestantism with some of those. I don't like to label things so much, but some of those hard right kind of nationalistic ideologies. No, they've made a big effort to become part of the mainstream culture of our country. That's what happened in 1940. In 1940, the evangelicals said, and it came out of some very specific theologians, and they said, no, we're not going to be separate and in opposition to our culture. We're going to engage in our culture and bring our faith and our love into our American culture. So they're not setting themselves up to oppose the institutions that God has established in our country.
Yeah,
And
that's an important point before you get to number 4. That's important because later in this conversation we are going to bring up political activists. And the question that always comes up is, well, if they're Christian and they're on the right side of the aisle, are they racist? Are they nationalistic? Are they this? Are they that? We're getting a sense already that they are not on the extreme sides of the political aisle for the most part.
that's certainly not been my experience, because I know I spent a lot of time with these people.
Right.
But we can
Okay,
talk
let's go
about
to the
those
last
are,
pillar
those are,
then.
those are great issues, Lou. We should talk about it. Okay, yeah, the last corner of the Bebington Quadrilateral is that the importance and the centrality of God's gift of grace through the crucifixion of Jesus. That we need salvation, we need the grace that God sent on the world through Jesus Christ. We are not worthy of the kingdom without it. So that's that centrality of the benefit that comes to us through the crucifixion of Jesus. So those are the 4 aspects: this personal rebirth experience, the centrality of the Bible, the dedication to public activism, and the need for redemptive grace through Jesus Christ.
4 pillars. Got it. So this is, in broad strokes, the Bibington Quadrilateral, the 4 pillars of evangelical Protestantism. And
Yeah.
I want to talk about that 3rd pillar about activism, because one of the biggest groups of people, especially on the right side of the aisle, that have taken up activism and identify with evangelical Protestantism is, for example, Turning Point USA and the late Charlie Kirk.
Mm-hmm.
Does any of those type of activities, whether Kirk and TPUSA or any movements like it, do those give signs of evangelical Protestantism being successful in creating a new cultural consensus? Or is it there doing its fulfilling the pillars, but not necessarily creating that huge social consensus that you're talking about is very much needed?
Are you asking about the level of impact, cultural impact?
Yes, yeah. What's the level of impact of movements like TPUSA and others who identify themselves as part of evangelical Protestantism?
Okay. Well, I will say the political impact has been huge. There's a whole bunch of elections, presidential elections. The first one being The first one is definitively impacted by the activism of evangelical Protestants was the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. To some extent, you could say that also about the election of Jimmy Carter. But the one that is really credited to the activism of evangelical Protestants, the first one is Ronald Reagan. And the most recent one, without any doubt, is our most recent election of President Trump. He would not have been, something like 77 or 80% of evangelical Protestants voted for Donald Trump. That's just a fact.
Wow.
And
That's a
they
huge
were,
number.
yes. And they were a deciding factor in the swing states. So my view is that it's not like Donald Trump. We should really make cause and effect clear here. The cause is a new spirituality in our country. The underlying spiritual movement happening within the United States is causing a change in the political culture of our country. It's not the other way around. The evangelicals, like everybody else, they have mixed feelings about Donald Trump. It's not a simple thing, but they had a choice to make in that election. And when Donald Trump gets the vote of, when there's 80 million evangelical Protestants and he gets 80% of their votes, they choose the president. And that's what's going on in our country. And if people are scared of that because they don't like Donald Trump, I'm sorry. I mean, I can understand why they would feel that way, but they have to try to kind of reconsider whether some of the values that the evangelical Protestants are trying to bring into our institutions aren't actually healthy, good values.
Right. It's like
That's
you
my
have to give credit where it's due. The
Yes.
Democrat Party, in my opinion, did not think about that demographic of people.
No,
Not at all. I mean, the
it's
four
not
pillars.
demographic.
The only pillar you could argue is public activism, but in evangelical Protestantism, it's public activism based on the Bible. And the platform of Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris was not featuring much to do with Christianity. For example, you had Christian celebrities, frankly, at
These are the
Republican
people.
events.
These are the people that, I hate to go back too far, but Hillary Clinton these are the people she calls deplorables. I mean,
And
am I
and
wrong?
and there was the comment about garbage, and then Donald Trump bought the garbage truck. It's not to say that the important part of this is that the strategy the Democrat Party used did not target a very important demographic in the United States of America, and one that should be obvious considering the spiritual roots of the country, which is part of what's so important about your post-Protestant thesis, is that the roots of the country are Christian, specifically Protestant. But somehow
That's right.
in 1980, we saw a new breed of Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism, start to shape politics. Do you have any idea why 1980 was the decisive year? Why that election? Why that year? What was happening? We were in the middle of the Cold War. The battle between democracy and communism. Why that year?
Well, I think that I could just say a couple things. The evangelical Protestants were not a political force before at all before Jimmy Carter. In the election of Jimmy Carter, they kind of got their act together because there was an evangelical Christian running for president. And they had a dry run. They had a dry run with Jimmy Carter. And they made an impact, but not a decisive impact. And then they changed their horse. They definitely changed their horses because, Jimmy Carter ran in 1980, ran against Ronald Reagan. And the evangelicals decided that Jimmy Carter was not their man, and they got behind Ronald Reagan, and they created a landslide. So that's one thing, Luke.
And that landslide was pretty unexpected. Isn't that right?
Oh, it was a shocker. And that landslide had a cause. And the Democrats better figure out how to align themselves with that cause because they are missing the boat. If you can't win the evangelical Protestants, you cannot win the presidency, I don't think, in this country. If you ignore their values.
Yeah, I mean, look at the 2016 election, even. That was predicted to be a very easy win for Hillary Clinton,
Mhm.
and she lost. And then in 2024,
Shocker.
Donald, yeah, and Donald in 2024, Donald Trump won handily that year. In 2016, the Electoral College, he kind of had a good majority, but he lost the popular vote. So it was a bit close, but not in 2024. He won the popular vote by a few million, and he won the Electoral College, and he won most, if not all, the swing states. So yeah, that's a big factor. And in our Higher Purpose Forum event that we both did on reflecting on the outcome of the 2024 election, that also kind of came up that there was something missing from the Democratic Party's strategy. They were
That's
missing
right.
the target with regard to a huge portion of the population. And the rise of figures such as Charlie Kirk, the late Charlie Kirk, even exemplify that. He's recognized as perhaps the most important leader of the broad, conservative movement. Now,
Well,
people on the left
he's an
side of the aisle and the
evangelical.
right side of the aisle are both acknowledging that very clearly, that he was the face. Everyone is saying of that movement, of that, and he was an evangelical.
Absolutely. He's an expression of that ethos, that culture. Luke, I would say that the other thing about 1980s, because right around then, you see, there's a basic political difference between mainline Protestantism and evangelical Protestantism. The mainline Protestantism is more liberal, and they're
Hmm.
absolutely in decline. And the number of adult Americans who became evangelical Protestants was going this way in 1980, and the mainline Protestants are going this way. And around 1978, 1980, the mainline Protestants became a lesser entity numerically. Then that's when the number of evangelical Protestants began to surpass mainline Protestants. So the evangelical Protestants started getting up their confidence as a political force. That also happened in
Wow.
1980.
Okay. Okay. So
And they
it's
had a
kind of this
candidate.
big turning point in Protestantism.
Yeah,
Mainline's
I
going
think so.
down, evangelicals going up. Evangelical has more conservative values. Therefore, their voice matters more and usually is going towards the conservative candidate, which nowadays is the Republican candidate. Okay.
Usually, the Republicans understand this dynamic that that's more important than they are, in my opinion. The Republican Party is way less significant culturally and historically than the emergence of evangelical Protestantism. That's the core cultural driver right now in our country. It's not the
Yeah. And
Republican Party.
if you see Donald Trump, he doesn't act like an evangelical Protestant, but
No,
he's
no, no, no.
appealed so well to that audience, to that population group. I mean,
Kind of
if you go
figured it
to
out, didn't
2015, he was considered the least conservative candidate out of all those
he?
people
Really?
that were on those big debate stages that Donald Trump, kept roasting. And, as kids, you watch those debates and you're like, Donald Trump is hilarious. And he doesn't act nearly as conservative as most of the other people on this stage. And yet he appeals so well to evangelical Protestants, so much so
He
that
cracked
some
the
of them, stake
yeah.
their life on him.
He cracked the code. He figured it out. He figured this out.
Yeah. And
And the
it's an interesting
Democrats have not.
question. Yeah. It's interesting to see,
They have not.
will they figure it out next election? And the political trends I'm seeing is no. I feel like they're going more to the left, which is farther away from the evangelical Protestants, far away from the Christian vote. And if the statistics
That's
that are
the way it
coming
seems to
out,
me.
yeah, and if it's true that evangelical Protestantism and other groups, because they're not alone, Catholics and Orthodox branches of Christianity, some people say their, population is on the rise. If they drift farther away from Christianity, in the long run, they're going to pay the price.
Well, you say Catholics drifting away from Christianity? I'm not sure
No,
I got what you said there.
Catholic and Orthodox branches of Christianity, those denominations, their population is increasing. There's more people joining Catholicism and Orthodoxy, according to some numbers out there. So
Good. Nice.
it could be a
Nice.
rude awakening, or it could just, and we talked about this in our last video, it could just increase the divide. And so that leads me to my last question is, the purpose of a new light movement is to finally create a new cultural consensus. Can evangelical Protestantism, despite its rise in numbers, despite its voice being louder and louder for the conservative side, can it actually create the new social consensus, or will it bridge, or will it make the bridge to bridge the divide be longer? Will it take longer to build? Will it span in length? Because all I see from the Democrat Party is they are moving more to the left and less so to the center, where they can actually appeal better to evangelical Protestants and other Christian groups of people.
Well, one thing I will say about evangelical Protestantism, which does not favor them furthering the emergence of a new social consensus as a new light movement must do, is that it's not really growing right now. It's actually slightly, if you look at the statistics reported in the Pew Religious Landscape Study or in Barna, it's kind of hard to define evangelical Protestantism because it's a very diverse and dispersed bunch of churches and people. But overall, there's no, they're not declining like other segments of Christianity, but they're at best stable. So that's one thing. Now, will they be able to broaden a social consensus? Luke, I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer to that question. They've made a tremendous amount of progress since 1980. And I think my view about the spiritual and moral health of our country is that we've benefited from that. I feel when I go to an evangelical Protestant church, I find it super uplifting. And I feel these are wonderful, family-oriented, responsible people. I would say that one thing that the evangelical Protestantism has to do is, first of all, become more multiracial, more ethnically dispersed. When I go to evangelical churches in Massachusetts, they're almost all white. When I go to evangelical churches in Chicago, they're very, it's a real mix, which is awesome to see. I think that I'm not an expert on evangelical Protestantism because it's not the tradition I grew up in, but they do have an image problem in being, people often call them white evangelicals. That's not a name that they want, not in this country, and not what God expects in this country. That's not the moniker that they want, the brand that they want to have. And I think in some places it's not an issue. In other places, I think it might be an issue. So
Right.
that's one consideration. But I believe that Reverend Moon taught us this. He said, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for president, but I'm going to tell you this. He said, you vote for the candidate who's most pro-family. He said, that's the person who should be president of our country. And I think to the extent that that evangelical Protestantism is relentlessly pro-family, they will flourish. In my religious, that's a spiritual answer, but I think that's the culture that will expand in our country, because that's the culture that will bring health and multiplication and innovation and warmth into our country, and people long for those things. And I do find that with an evangelical Protestant. So I think the ball is kind of in their court. I don't really know what their answer is going to be in the long term, but they've made a tremendous amount of progress. And I think it's very exciting to see this movement in our country. The real kind of the new light who kicked this off, you really have to say it was Billy Graham in the 1950s. Or even before that. He He was really one of the real new lights that really got this thing going. He became a mainstream spiritual leader in our country.
Yeah, no doubt. I think the fruits of movements that change the social consensus, the fruit is a substantial change in how life is lived on a day-to-day basis, even at the legal level. So, for example, the civil rights movement, the last great movement that created a whole new social consensus, it finally shut down Jim Crow substantially. Like, it was gone. African Americans and black people could vote, no questions asked. Now, there were other things that were done post civil rights movement, absolutely, but there were substantial changes in reality, even at the legal level. So, what does
Mhm.
that look like for today? With what, so for example, what things are evangelical Protestants actively trying to change in terms of regular life in this country? It that's the question I have to ask in order to determine whether they can do it. I mean, I know they're very big on things such as abortion. They're very big
Mhm.
on things such as no transgender ideology and no transgender surgeries. They're big on
Mhm.
not having gay marriage, going back to that idea of traditional family values. And so then the question becomes,
Because they rely.
right, and so can the Bible by itself, because that's the basis for everything in evangelical Protestantism, bridge, integrate, to use a Jung, to use a term from Carl Jung. God and the Godhead is just a father figure. Now, however you look at it, religious terms, family terms, psychological terms like Carl Jung did, even in narrative terms like Joseph Campbell did, you can't get rid of the shadow, which evangelical Protestants, feel is this transgender ideology, this LGBTQ ideology rooted in, Marxist Leninist theories. If you want it to really go away, you have to actually integrate the shadow. That's what Carl Jung taught. And part of that is the principle of duality. So you're not just integrating your shadow, you're integrating order and chaos, male and female. Can the Bible fully do that? I'm not so sure at the current reading of the Bible.
Spiritual leadership remains so masculine, so resolutely masculine. It can't cope with a lot of the challenges that Christian leaders are now being asked to take responsibility for.
Right. Like, I'm not saying, 4B movement, feminist ideology. I'm saying the role of the mother. The role of the mother has to be integrated because you can have masculine leadership, but at the end of the day, if you don't have, you can have the father all you'd like, that which Christianity has, the, Orthodoxy, church fathers, the priest is the father. In evangelical Protestantism, pastor, that fatherly figure, the father is always up front. But if you don't have the mother giving that different kind of love, that more compassionate kind of love, you will never get members of the LGBTQ community, members of the gay community, members of America that consider themselves Marxist, even though some of them won't say it out loud. You will never get them back without that motherly heart. You cannot get it back. And you can't
That's a great point.
purge a group of people in your country. You can't purge groups of people without consequences. That's not integration.
Right.
It
And
there
that's
will
the
be
knock.
negative
That's the
consequences.
knock. Yeah. That's the very knock against the evangelicals, and that's the knock against President Trump, is that, not enough heart, not enough compassion, not enough forgiveness, not enough warmth, not enough flexibility. That all that is maternal, is motherly, is feminine. There's not enough of that heart in that. That's the. I don't know to what extent it's fair. I think no. I think it is fair. I think it is fair.
Yeah,
And
and
so I
and
think you're onto something here, Lou.
yeah, and like I said in our last video, there's a time to divide, there's a time to throw everything away. And if some good stuff is thrown away, then so be it. Like Donald Trump is the divider, and he's the divider because America needs that kind of division, like good, evil, borders or no borders, man and woman or not man and woman, basics. But to create the new social consensus, eventually you will have to have that integration, which has to include that more feminine heart. I'm not saying, oh, all our women should be all the leaders. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you need something or someone or some spirit that is motherly, that's rooted in God, that's rooted in the Bible. Because they're right. If you just say, oh, we need mothers, we need women, then you'll get feminism, and that devolves into things like, in the most extreme example, the 4B movement in South Korea. So that's why I say it can't fully do it, unless it can find a way to eventually balance the father figure, that masculine type of leadership, with a bit more feminine energy where you are treating immigrants with some humanity. You are not mocking them on the internet because they're just a family trying to escape the drug cartels that pervade Central and Latin America.
So, Luke, let me ask you a question then. How does that happen within our culture, within evangelical Protestant tradition or community?
Well,
That's kind of a hard question, I guess.
well, one thing that is interesting is that Charlie Kirk's wife is now taking over the mantle of TPUSA. She
I
is
see.
leading it now. And and she's a very, she's very high on traditional motherhood. So I'm very curious to see what
Mm-hmm.
that looks like and if that is an example of that kind of change. I'm not, so I don't have an answer, but only because in evangelical Protestant circles, you're now seeing a big prominent example of a woman leader. And she's very rooted in the Bible, very rooted in, broad strokes conservatism. So it's unlikely she's going to fall prey
She's got
to
it.
the waves of post 1960 feminism. So we'll see. Um, Potentially. I
Yeah.
mean, in the unification movement, a woman leader that's been presented is Dr. Hak Ja Moon, partly because
Yep.
she's a woman leader who has a divine mandate she feels given by God for some sort of divine mission. And she's not rooted in that kind of feminism where women, we don't need men. It's very men and women together. So we'll see.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm not sure how much hope I have, but I'm always open to see.
Well, it's a good example. Both Mother Hak Ja Moon and Charlie Kirk's very, very articulate, artistic, beautiful wife. Those are two great examples of female spiritual leaders who bring something that we really need in order to create a more, a real refreshed spiritual consensus.
Yeah. And if we can do that, if they can do that, especially centered on the Bible, then there's hope. But if not, then hope is slim, I feel. Because the more,
Mm.
if you divide too much, if you are harsh too much, eventually you will get a violent reaction. And you already see that with the No Kings protests, which I personally think are a bit laughable. However, you see something dangerous, despite how let's kind of small they are in the grand scheme of things, those type of protests. But you see some of the signs, and it says Charlie Kirk got what he deserved. F Trump. Someone kill him. Someone kill this conservatives. It's like there is a brewing violence that has to be taken care of. And as much as we
Yeah.
want to say, oh, they just need to not do that, they have to take responsibility for their own actions, they are rooted in a violent ideology, which is Marxism, which calls for change through violent revolution. Now, the only fix is if you kind of integrate and balance it out a little, I feel. Once you've taken out the trash, it's like, okay, now let's rebuild this new social consensus. I think that's the opportunity we have in 2028. Donald Trump hopefully will complete his work in what I see as this kind of divider type thing. And then we need a kind of new leader in the United States to take up the mantle of rebuilding that social consensus.
Nikki Haley.
Many conservatives will not like her, but perhaps her, perhaps Tulsi Gabbard. There's a few options in the, broad strokes conservative move. Although Tulsi Gabbard probably wouldn't identify herself necessarily as conservative. There are some women in the current Trump administration and in evangelical Protestant circles or adjacent that potentially could take up that mantle. But we'll have to see.
But just because they're women doesn't mean they won't have that harshness, that heavy-handedness that is now on display in Washington. Now, you're saying that maybe that's necessary for an intermediate period. Maybe it is, but it certainly is creating a reaction. The underlying spiritual phenomena, in my opinion, evangelical Protestantism, if you go into the way to do, original source-based research on this question is to go into those churches, and as I do, and check it out and see what their culture is like, and see if there's a role for feminine leadership, and see if they're benevolent and broad-based in terms of welcoming a broad spectrum of people. That's the place to where that question can be answered, in my opinion. I go to these church services, and I really feel very, very hopeful about the future of our country when I see that a lot of people get scared or turned off by this term. There's a connotation. It comes, maybe it's wrapped up in the experience people had with fundamentalism or with the televangelist scandals, which did a real number on the confidence of the evangelicals. But nevertheless, if you go in and see for yourself, skeptics should go into these churches and spend a few Sundays visiting evangelical churches and see how they feel. That's the place to find out about what's going on in our culture, I think.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for answering those questions and having this conversation. I feel that evangelical Protestantism is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's shaping the outcome of our elections. And I hope that those of you who watched were able to gain some insight and think about how our country's been moving these past several decades. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. And you've added a lot to the conversation. But the points that you've made at the end there, Luke, were very interesting to hear about. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And, I'll continue to develop this point of view as I talk to more people, as I study more. So that's what this channel is all about. So if you are new to the channel or you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. And please like this video and check out the content that Mr. Edgerly has been doing with the Higher Purpose Forum and this topic about post-Protestantism and now evangelical Protestantism. I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.